Hello, I'm Justin Lefley, and for my research project, I decided to look at how American lifestyle influences climate change. The main objectives I had while doing my research was to discover first how American lifestyle does in fact influence climate change, and secondly, to figure out how climate change will influence global society and the planet into the future. Early studies of climate change go back as far as the 1950s. One of the first leading scientists on the topic was Roger Revelle, and he collected carbon from the atmosphere on an annual basis and recorded the carbon activity over a period of about 25 years. His main conclusion from his research, rather early on in his study, was that human activity in fact does influence climate change. In the years since, many studies and different scientists have come to the same conclusion through a lot of different ways. And it's a general consensus that by the year 2100, we're going to see an average temperature increase of about 4 to 12 degrees Fahrenheit. When it comes to the economics of climate change, one major reason that large initiatives often aren't undertaken to fix the problem is because climate change creates what's known as an externality. The parties involved in creating pollution and those that demand the products that lead to the pollution aren't directly affected by climate change in the short term. Typically, the more impoverished countries and nations that are less developed are the ones that really face the brunt of the costs that are associated with climate change. One way to change this and take the pollution out of the realm of an externality and make it tangible costs for those involved in the practice is by instilling a carbon tax. What a carbon tax does, much like a sin tax on cigarettes and alcohol, is discourages the bad behavior by increasing costs on suppliers, so they'll be encouraged to find greener alternatives, and then in turn raise the price for the consumer to encourage them to, again, either find greener alternatives or use less of the product that's creating the pollution. Dirty energy has had a large impact on climate change into the distant past. Exxon and Mobil is now known was aware of climate change as early as 1977. At the time, they did a lot of different scientific research on climate change, and their lead scientist came to the conclusion and presented it to them that something major needed to be done to change the path that they were on within the next 10 years, or the damage from climate change would become harder and harder to reverse. Instead of taking this information and trying to change the practices and their influence on it, they decided to go the opposite way and spread misinformation to confuse the public as well as the government on the topic. In doing this, they created the Global Climate Change Coalition, which in 1998 blocked the Kyoto Protocol, which was an agreement among different nations to influence carbon emissions and try to reduce them as much as possible. In the end, they were able to persuade the United States to not participate in the treaty, as well as China and India. Another major element where the fossil fuel industry really plays into misguiding climate change is today 1/3 of Congress are considered climate deniers. And that means that they believe or say they believe that humanity has no impact on climate change. One interesting fact along with this is that the average dirty energy contributions over the career of a senator who is a climate denier is nearly $1 million, while for non-deniers from that same industry, their contributions are about a quarter of that. In the House, we see a similar situation where climate deniers get about $300,000 over their career, while non-deniers get only about 1/3 of that. When it comes to the actual facts, 97% of scientists that study climate change believe that human activity does play a role in it and is one of the leading causes of climate change. Yet we see, besides Congress, the general population still often has a hard time accepting this. It seems odd that there would be, on the scientific end, there's such a confirmation that, in fact, human activity does play a role, and yet people still don't want to accept that. This could be in part because, or explained by a 2015 study published in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, which states that when people's core beliefs are challenged, they tend to shut out the facts and just hold their prior beliefs as truth. And it's harder and harder to persuade them because once they disregard facts, there's no way to really reason with them and get them to see the truth. This goes back to the early misinformation spread, and it continues to be spread on the fact of climate change because it continues to cloud people's understanding and create that pre-understanding that possibly it's not caused by human activity. A major American element of society that leads to climate change and pollution is our American consumerism. Planned obsolescence, which was first introduced in the early part of the 20th century as a way to shorten the useful life on products so that consumers would need to purchase them again more frequently and thus drive economic demand, is still in place to this day. And in a large part, it creates a lot of extra waste as old products are discarded and we replace them with new products, which continues to deplete natural resources. As society does change and shift, now a lot of consumers demand better quality products, and while that does and should increase the useful life, manufacturers are now using styling and continuous technological updates to make those older products less desirable and still be replaced, even though they're still well into their useful life. Another element of American society that influences our consumerism is that happiness is often gauged off material wealth. And it's such a hard thing to satisfy because we often look at other people and what they have, and once we reach their level, we look at the next level, which is just a continuing cycle. So as we take in more and more natural resources in our products, we still demand more in this pursuit of happiness. Another major element of American lifestyle that leads to climate change is the American diet. We have in part a large meat-based diet, and in fact we're the second largest meat-consuming country in the world per capita. Of the meat groups that Americans typically consume, beef is the number one by a pretty large margin. And this is such a major issue as it relates to climate change because cows produce 1/3 of total methane emissions annually. And methane heats up the atmosphere 20 times more and faster than that of CO2. Producing beef also requires a lot of other resources. To produce just a single pound of beef, it requires 2,500 gallons of water, 12 pounds of grain, 35 pounds of topsoil, and 1 gallon of gasoline. So, in as much meat as we consume, and as many people are consuming it, it just exponentially uses all of these resources. On a positive note, we have made a lot of progress when it comes to the topic of climate change. People in the American public tend to be more embracing of climate-friendly practices. Consumer consciousness is taking effect, and people are more aware of the products that they're purchasing and how those products do influence climate change in the environment. Environmental advocacy groups are working to change public opinion to support the facts that we do in fact influence climate change, as well as push through legislation that protects the environment. And the biggest hope is as technology innovations continue, we'll be able to make our products using less resources and that they waste less energy. So we become a more environmentally friendly nation. The best hope for change in reversing the effects of climate change is working together. No single nation, scientist, or individual on their own can tackle this issue. It's going to be how we all work together in the future to make it a major focus and try to correct the course that we're currently on. Also, by taking action now is another important step, because the longer that we wait to put all these thoughts into action, the harder it's going to be able to reverse the major effects of climate change. Thank you very much for your time, and here are my sources.